India is not just another emerging country that the West can calculate with their spreadsheets, analyze with their economic models, or reduce to GDP growth figures. It is something much deeper, much older, something that cannot be comprehended by the shallow categories of modern analysis. It is a civilization that has survived wave after wave of conquest, colonization, and ideological imposition, and yet, unlike many others, it has retained its core identity. You cannot say the same for Rome, you cannot say the same for Babylon, and you certainly cannot say the same for most European empires. They rose, they flourished, and they crumbled, swallowed by time, leaving fragments of themselves behind. But India endures, it persists, it reinvents itself while refusing to abandon its essence. That is not the mark of fragility, it is the mark of civilizational strength. And when the West looks at that endurance, what they see is something profoundly unsettling. Civilizations in the West have been taught to view progress as linear, as though history is a straight road moving forward, and that whatever is new is automatically better. But India demonstrates something radically different, that progress can be circular, resilient, and regenerative. It doesn't discard its past in the pursuit of novelty. Instead, it absorbs and integrates it. The philosophies that emerged thousands of years ago still shape daily life, not as relics, but as living forces. When the West sees this, it recognizes that its own philosophy of endless consumerism and shallow individualism is brittle by comparison. They sense that they have severed themselves from their own roots, while India continues to draw nourishment from its ancient traditions. And that is terrifying, because it suggests that their linear model of history may not be the only way forward. The West has built much of its identity on conquest, on dominance, on rewriting the world in its own image. But here is a civilization that refused to be erased, that refused to bow down completely to external powers, no matter how long they ruled. The British could take the gold, they could take the resources, they could enforce their language and systems, but they could not take away the Indian psyche. The very fact that India emerged from centuries of colonial subjugation, not destroyed, but alive, creative, and determined, unsettles the narrative of Western superiority. It proves that even the strongest empire cannot permanently dominate a people rooted in something larger than material power. That realization is frightening because it punctures the myth that the West alone holds the key to resilience and survival. Cultural depth is not just about art, music, or philosophy. It is about the ability to anchor human beings in meaning across time. In India, meaning is not outsourced to fleeting ideologies or abstract theories, but woven into the fabric of daily life. Families are not simply economic units but sacred bonds. Rituals are not superstitions but structures of stability. Language is not just a tool for commerce but a carrier of wisdom. When the West looks at this, it sees a contrast with its own disintegration of meaning. It sees loneliness, declining communities, collapsing family structures, and the emptiness of consumer substitutes. India's cultural depth reminds them of what they have lost and worse. It reminds them that what they lost may never return. That haunting realization creates a deep unease, hidden beneath the surface of global diplomacy and economic competition. What terrifies the West even more is that India's cultural continuity is not passive. It is increasingly active. The younger generations, instead of discarding their heritage, are beginning to rediscover it. They are reading ancient texts alongside modern science. They are practicing yoga not as a fad, but as a discipline of mind and body. They are reclaiming spiritual frameworks that give strength to their ambitions. This synthesis of old and new is unlike anything the West has seen. In the West, modernity often came at the price of tradition, but in India, modernity is beginning to serve tradition. That is an extraordinary psychological advantage. Because when a society feels rooted, it is not easily manipulated, it does not collapse under the weight of external pressure, and it does not seek validation from others. This independence of spirit is what unsettles those who have grown accustomed to shaping the world's narratives. If you look carefully at history, you will see that civilizations fall not only because of external enemies, but because of internal emptiness. Rome didn't collapse simply because of barbarian invasions. It collapsed because it lost its sense of meaning and unity. The same applies to many great powers, but when the West looks at India, it does not see emptiness. It sees a civilization brimming with continuity. Even in poverty, even in difficulty, there is still music, ritual, prayer, and celebration. The threads of identity hold firm even when external circumstances shift. This is profoundly destabilizing to the Western mind because it contradicts their deepest assumptions. That prosperity creates meaning, that wealth secures happiness, that dominance ensures longevity. India demonstrates that meaning can survive even without prosperity, and when prosperity is added to meaning, the result is unstoppable. The psychological fear runs deeper than geopolitics or economics. The West is built on the idea that its systems, capitalism, democracy, secularism, are the universal models for human flourishing. But India suggests otherwise. India shows that there are multiple ways of organizing society that do not rely on cutting ties with tradition. It shows that modernity can exist without abandoning spirituality, that democracy can thrive amidst diversity of language, caste, and religion, and that innovation can flourish alongside respect for ancestry. This challenges the West's ideological supremacy. It whispers a dangerous thought. Perhaps the West is not the pinnacle of history. Perhaps it is only one path among many. And if that is true, their sense of global authority begins to crumble. Civilizational strength is measured not only by what survives, but by what inspires. When Indian thought, philosophy, and culture spread globally, they do so not through force, but through attraction. Yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, these are not imposed on the world by armies. They are welcomed by millions voluntarily. That is soft power in its most potent form, and it is far more durable than weapons or sanctions. The West knows that influence gained through attraction lasts longer than influence gained through coercion. And so when they see India exporting not only goods but wisdom, they recognize a subtle shift in global culture. They fear that the moral and psychological leadership of the world may be slipping away from them, not with violence, but with quiet persuasion. At the heart of this fear lies an unspoken recognition that India's endurance exposes the fragility of the West's own cultural foundations. The West is increasingly struggling with questions of identity, with the collapse of collective meaning, with the fragmentation of societies into isolated individuals. They try to fill the void with technology, with consumer goods, with ideologies that shift every decade. But these are temporary patches, not lasting answers. When they look at India, they see a society that, despite its flaws, possesses something they cannot manufacture, a civilizational backbone. It is this backbone that makes India capable of withstanding storms and continuing to grow. And it is this backbone that makes the West uneasy, because it reveals that true strength is not built in decades but in millennia. The West looks at India in 2025 and sees something they can neither replicate nor control, a young, ambitious population surging with energy. While their own societies are aging, with birth rates plummeting below replacement levels, India's demographics paint a completely different picture. Here is a nation with the largest youth population on Earth, filled with people entering their most productive years, ready to create, to innovate, and to lead. This isn't just a matter of numbers, it's a matter of vitality. A civilization's future is carried in the energy of its young, and India has that energy in abundance. The West, by contrast, is slowly moving into a future of graying populations, shrinking labor forces, and overburdened welfare systems. That contrast alone is enough to strike fear into the heart of those who once claimed to own the future. Demographics are destiny, and no empire has survived long once its population began to decline. When societies stop reproducing, they lose not just people but the very spirit that drives them forward. Look at Europe, where empty villages and declining schools reveal a future of stagnation. Look at Japan, where the elderly vastly outnumber the young, creating a society locked in preservation rather than expansion. The West faces the same trajectory, yet it has no solution, because its people no longer believe in family, tradition, or sacrifice for the next generation. India, however, is brimming with new families, new children, and a population that believes the future is theirs to seize. This is not just a demographic fact, it is a psychological revolution. The young population of India represents more than workforce numbers, it represents a mindset of ambition. Millions of young Indians are learning skills, entering universities, and building careers in industries that will define the future. Technology, medicine, space exploration, and artificial intelligence, they are not content with survival, they are hungry for growth. When a generation believes that upward mobility is possible, it transforms not only individuals but entire societies. This is what the West sees and fears, an entire civilization with youth who still believe in possibility, in the future, in their ability to build something larger than themselves. That belief, more than any statistic, is what generates power. In contrast, the West's youth are increasingly disillusioned. Burdened by student debt, struggling with collapsing job markets, and questioning even the value of building families, they face a crisis of purpose. Many of them are retreating into nihilism, into despair, into ideologies that reject responsibility altogether. That is what happens when a society loses its faith in growth. When the young do not see a future worth striving toward, civilization stagnates. India, however, is experiencing the opposite phenomenon. Its youth, though facing challenges, still carry the conviction that tomorrow can be better than today. That conviction fuels risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and innovation, while in the West, skepticism and fear hold the younger generations back. A youthful nation is not just a workforce, it is also a cultural force. Young people redefine art, technology, communication, and politics. When you have 1 billion citizens, nearly 2/3 of whom are under the age of 35, you have a cultural engine that can reshape global trends. This is why India's music, cinema, fashion, and ideas are rapidly spreading beyond its borders. The West fears this soft power as much as it fears economic competition, because culture defines influence more deeply than policy or economics. A youthful, confident India can export not only products but meaning, style, and identity. That prospect threatens Western dominance in areas they have long considered their own. Population is also a matter of scale. In the global economy, size matters because the ability to produce, consume, and innovate multiplies with numbers. India's young demographic is not just a source of labor. It is also a massive consumer base. Multinational corporations cannot ignore 1 billion potential customers, most of them young and tech-savvy. That purchasing power will gradually shift global markets toward India's preferences, values, and needs. For the West, accustomed to shaping consumer culture, this represents a profound shift. They fear a future where global markets no longer reflect Western tastes but Indian ones. And with that shift, cultural authority begins to erode. But numbers alone are not enough. What matters is what a society chooses to do with them. India's demographic advantage becomes terrifying to the West because it is now paired with ambition and education. Each year, millions of engineers, doctors, scientists, and entrepreneurs emerge from Indian universities. These young professionals are not only filling domestic roles, but also leading in global institutions. In Silicon Valley, in medicine, in academia, Indians are not guests anymore. They are leaders. The West sees this and recognizes that the intellectual centers of power are being infused with Indian talent. That is a shift that cannot be reversed, because once a demographic becomes indispensable, it also becomes undeniable. The West also understands the danger of comparison. When their citizens look at India's youthful rise, they will inevitably begin to question their own societies. They will ask why their governments cannot inspire ambition, why their families cannot grow, why their futures feel smaller rather than larger. That comparative despair threatens internal stability in the West. India, by thriving demographically, exposes the failures of societies that have chosen comfort over continuity. The fear is not only external competition, but internal collapse, triggered by the recognition that another civilization is moving forward while theirs stagnates. That recognition is perhaps the deepest psychological terror of all. There is another dimension often overlooked: resilience. Youth are adaptable, flexible, and willing to take risks. An aging population is conservative, cautious, and resistant to change. The West's aging demographics mean that innovation slows down, industries grow rigid, and political systems resist transformation. India's youth, however, are eager to adapt, to reinvent, to experiment. That resilience makes them more capable of handling crises, whether economic, technological, or political. For the West, this is a sobering realization. The next era of global change may be shaped not by them, but by a society that is young enough to embrace transformation. And that possibility shakes their confidence in their own dominance. At its core, the fear of India's demographic destiny is the fear of being replaced. For centuries, the West has assumed that it would always set the tone for global progress, that its declining birth rates could be compensated by technology, automation, and intellectual dominance. But demographics cannot be faked. When a civilization has more people, more families, more ambition, and more cultural vitality, it eventually reshapes the balance of power. The West, facing decline, sees in India a mirror of what it once was: young, restless, hungry for greatness. And seeing that reflection is not only unsettling, it is terrifying, because it suggests that history may be moving away from them, carried on the shoulders of India's youth. India's rise is not confined to economics or technology, though those are the measures the West is most comfortable using to calculate power. What unsettles them more deeply is that India's growth is being driven by something beneath the material layer: an intellectual and spiritual resurgence. This resurgence means that India's development is not hollow, not merely built on consumption or imitation, but tied to an ancient reservoir of meaning. The West has grown accustomed to nations borrowing its systems, its ideas, and its philosophies, often at the cost of their own identities. But India is charting a different course, embracing modern science and industry, while simultaneously rediscovering its oldest wisdom. The West doesn't quite know how to interpret this, because it does not fit the categories of either tradition or progress. It is something else entirely, and that something else frightens them. For centuries, colonizers attempted to strip India of its intellectual heritage, branding its philosophies as superstition, its traditions as backwardness, and its spirituality as irrelevant to modernity. They imposed their systems of education, hoping to create generations that would see themselves only through Western eyes. Yet despite this, the Indian spirit refused to die. Ancient texts were preserved, traditions were practiced, and identity was kept alive beneath the surface. Now, as India grows in wealth and influence, these intellectual and spiritual traditions are being revived not as relics, but as sources of strength. That revival is unnerving to the West, because it suggests that their centuries of dominance did not erase what they intended to erase. Instead, it created a deeper determination to reclaim what was lost. This resurgence also matters because it gives Indians something the West increasingly lacks: a coherent framework of meaning. The modern West is plagued by nihilism, by confusion about values, by the collapse of religion without an adequate replacement. Its young people are searching for something to believe in, often falling into despair or shallow substitutes. India, on the other hand, has meaning baked into its very structure. It does not need to invent a new framework. It can draw from thousands of years of philosophy, ethics, and spirituality that remain relevant. When this meaning is paired with ambition and education, it produces not only intelligent individuals, but resilient individuals. That resilience terrifies the West because it is not easily measured, and it cannot be broken by mere economic or political pressure. The resurgence is not only personal but societal. As young Indians rediscover yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, and ancient philosophies, they are integrating them into modern life in ways that strengthen rather than weaken their drive. This creates a population that is not only skilled in technology, but also grounded in psychological discipline. The West sees this as a dangerous combination: technical expertise paired with spiritual strength. Because technical skill without grounding can be manipulated, but technical skill anchored in meaning becomes unstoppable. A society that is spiritually awake cannot be subdued by consumerism alone, nor can it be enslaved by shallow promises of progress. This is why the West feels unease when it sees India reclaiming its spiritual root. It signals a kind of independence that cannot be bought or sold. The intellectual tradition of India is equally threatening to Western assumptions. Long before Europe's Enlightenment, Indian thinkers debated logic, mathematics, consciousness, and ethics at levels of sophistication the world is only now beginning to appreciate. These ideas were not destroyed, they were merely sidelined. But today, as Indian scholars, scientists, and innovators draw connections between ancient insights and modern discoveries, the West sees a new intellectual rival emerging. Concepts of mind, self, and reality that were once dismissed as mystical are now being validated by neuroscience and psychology. If India succeeds in bringing these traditions back into global discourse, it will no longer be the West dictating what counts as knowledge. That shift threatens not just their power but their intellectual pride. When civilizations rediscover their purpose, they often enter their most dynamic phases. The West knows this from its own history. The Renaissance was not simply about science and art. It was about rediscovering classical roots, about reconnecting with ancient sources of meaning. That rediscovery created centuries of dominance. Now the West sees India undergoing something similar, but on a scale and depth that could dwarf the Renaissance. India is not rediscovering a few centuries of heritage. It is reconnecting with millennia. That scale of intellectual and spiritual awakening can power not just growth, but transformation. For a West already insecure about its fading influence, this is a terrifying prospect, because it suggests the next Renaissance might not happen in Europe or America, but in India. The fear grows sharper because this resurgence is not isolationist. India is not retreating into its past. It is bringing its past into dialogue with the modern world. Its thinkers are publishing globally, its teachers are spreading practices across continents, its diaspora is weaving intellectual and spiritual traditions into universities, corporations, and governments worldwide. This blending of global reach with civilizational confidence makes the West nervous. They are used to exporting ideas, not importing them. They are used to being the teacher, not the student. But India's intellectual and spiritual resurgence suggests that the flow of knowledge may soon reverse. That reversal is not just uncomfortable, it undermines the very narrative of Western superiority. What makes this resurgence even more intimidating is that it aligns with the deepest human needs. In an era of loneliness, anxiety, and identity crises, India offers practices and philosophies that directly address human suffering. Meditation and yoga are not merely trends. They are answers to universal problems of meaning and mental health. As millions in the West adopt these practices, consciously or not, they are turning to India for guidance. This creates a subtle but powerful shift in authority. The West fears this because it cannot compete with answers that go beyond materialism. When people find spiritual fulfillment in Indian traditions, they look less to Western systems for purpose. That undermines the West's psychological influence over the global population. The resurgence also suggests that India is not simply borrowing modernity, it is redefining it. A modernity that includes spirituality, that honors tradition, that respects family, and that integrates meaning with progress, is not the modernity the West envisioned. Theirs was based on abandoning the past, on secularizing the sacred, on divorcing progress from meaning. But if India proves that progress can coexist with spirituality, the West will be forced to confront the possibility that its model is not universal. That realization is deeply unsettling because it challenges centuries of intellectual dominance. It means the future of humanity may be shaped not in the image of the West, but in the image of a civilization that refused to surrender its soul. At the core of this intellectual and spiritual resurgence lies a simple truth. Power is not only about wealth or weapons, but about meaning. Societies that offer meaning endure, and societies that lose it collapse. The West, facing a crisis of meaning, sees India not only rising, but rising with purpose. That is a combination that history has always favored. It terrifies those who assumed that their decline could be masked by technology or temporary wealth. Because when meaning returns to a civilization of 1 billion people, backed by ambition, youth, and continuity, it does not just rise. It transforms the entire balance of the world. For centuries, West has written the rules of the world. They designed the institutions, they shaped the language of diplomacy, they dictated the terms of economics, and they claimed the authority to define morality itself. Nations that resisted were punished, and those that complied were rewarded with temporary privileges. This monopoly over rulemaking gave them a sense of invincibility, as if history itself was on their side. But history does not belong to any one civilization. It shifts, it adapts, it moves toward the societies that can embody strength and resilience. When India rises, it does not merely grow in wealth or power. It begins to question the very foundations of a Western-dominated order. And for those who built their dominance on the illusion of permanence, that is a frightening realization. What the West fears most is not competition but replacement. It is one thing to share influence. It is another to lose the power to define the narrative of progress. For decades, institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF have reflected Western priorities. Global trade routes, military alliances, and cultural flows all ran through Western capitals. But India's growth threatens to decentralize this authority. A world in which Delhi has as much weight as Washington or London is a world where the West is no longer the unquestioned referee. The rules themselves may change, shaped by values and perspectives not rooted in European history, but in Indian civilization. That possibility shakes the very core of the Western psyche. This shift is not only structural, but symbolic. For centuries, the West portrayed itself as the center of human progress, the torchbearer of enlightenment, the guardian of modernity. Yet India's rise disrupts that mythology. It demonstrates that progress can emerge from outside the Western world, that innovation and modernity are not the exclusive property of Europe and America. The symbolism is powerful because it undermines the very story the West has told itself and the world for generations. If India can rise while staying rooted in its own traditions, then the Western model of progress is revealed to be optional, not universal. And once that story collapses, so too does the aura of inevitability surrounding Western dominance. The balance of economic power is already shifting. India's expanding markets, technological growth, and manufacturing potential position it as a rival not only in size but in influence. Multinational corporations increasingly orient themselves toward India's consumers, not Europe's shrinking populations. Global supply chains recognize the value of Indian labor, skill, and adaptability. The West sees this trend and understands its implications. Economic dominance is not merely about wealth. It is about the ability to set the terms of trade, to dictate the norms of commerce, and to shape the flow of capital. As India asserts itself, those terms begin to slip from Western hands, and that loss is not measured only in money, it is measured in power. Military and strategic influence follows economics. The West has long relied on its military superiority to enforce its authority, but demographics and economic shifts are gradually eroding this advantage. India's growing defense capabilities, combined with its strategic geographic position, mean that it cannot be ignored in global security discussions. The Indian Ocean, once viewed as a Western, controlled space, is now increasingly under India's watchful eye. This development unsettles Western powers because it reduces their capacity to project dominance. When economic power is paired with strategic autonomy, the rules of global security themselves begin to change. For those who have long dictated those rules, the prospect of sharing or losing control is unnerving. Cultural influence is another domain where India's rise reshapes the global order. Hollywood, Western universities, and Western media have long dominated the construction of global narratives. They decided which stories were told, which values were celebrated, and which identities were erased. But India's cultural presence is expanding. Its cinema, philosophy, literature, and spirituality are reaching global audiences, not as curiosities but as alternatives. The spread of Indian culture undermines the Western monopoly on soft power. Influence built on attraction is harder to resist than influence built on coercion. And when people around the world begin to look toward India for inspiration rather than only to the West, the cultural balance of power begins to tilt. What amplifies the West's unease is that India's rise is multipolar rather than mimetic. It is not trying to replicate the Western model of empire or dominance. Instead, it is shaping a new kind of global influence, one that allows for diversity and multiplicity. This is dangerous to the West precisely because it challenges the binary logic of superiority and submission. If India proves that civilizations can rise without imitating the West, then the monopoly on defining modernity is shattered. Other nations will follow, inspired by India's example, and the Western hold on the imagination of the world will erode. This is why India's growth in 2025 feels less like competition and more like a revolution in the architecture of power. The psychological aspect of this shift cannot be underestimated. For centuries, the West viewed itself as the elder guiding less advanced civilizations toward maturity. India's rise reverses that dynamic. A civilization older, deeper, and more continuous than the West now demonstrates that it can thrive in the modern age on its own terms. This inversion of the mentor-student relationship destabilizes the Western sense of identity. They are no longer the teachers, they are increasingly the observers. And when a civilization that once considered itself eternal begins to sense its decline, it reacts not with humility but with fear. That fear is at the root of their unease about India's growth. Global power has always been about more than material resources, it has been about legitimacy. The West has maintained legitimacy by convincing the world that it alone embodies progress, reason, and freedom. But India's rise introduces an alternative legitimacy, one rooted in cultural continuity, spiritual meaning, and democratic vitality within diversity. This legitimacy cannot be dismissed as an anomaly, because it resonates with billions of people worldwide who see in India a reflection of their own struggles for identity and dignity. When legitimacy shifts, dominance follows. The West understands this, and it is why India's growing stature feels like an existential threat rather than mere competition. At the heart of this shift lies an unavoidable reality: history does not stop. No civilization holds permanent ownership of the future. The West assumed that its dominance was the final chapter, that globalization meant westernization, that the 21st century would forever bear its imprint. But India's rise in 2025 demonstrates that history remains open, dynamic, and unpredictable. A civilization once dismissed as too fragmented, too spiritual, or too chaotic to lead is now proving that resilience, meaning, and ambition can outlast centuries of domination. And when the balance of global power shifts in this way, it does not just change geopolitics. It changes the story humanity tells itself about where the future lies.